Your testable skills exercises will be found on page 223 and 224 of this edition of the textbook. If you have a previous edition of the textbook, the chapter and section, well, the section title is going to be Venn diagram technique for testing syllogisms. Now, the exercises in the following section incorporate your identification of the formal fallacies that we covered last week. We can do that with the exercises on pages 223 and 224, even though the instructions don't indicate that. And the reason I want to avoid the exercises in the section that deals with formal fallacies is because the author includes a fallacy that we're not responsible for. And that's the fallacy of four terms. And we notice that quite a few of the English language arguments commit that fallacy, so I think ultimately it could be confusing. So let's just focus on pages 223 and 224. You'll notice on 223 you have some number of moods and figure. There's, I'm not sure how many on the test, 3 or 4 moods and figure, for which you will do the following instructions. And we'll start with number 3. It's OAO3, mood and figure. The instructions on the test will tell you to reconstruct the argument form that's indicated by that mood and figure. Then, use the Venn diagram to prove the argument form to be valid or invalid. If it's invalid, identify all formal fallacies committed. So, do you remember the procedure for taking our mood and figure and reconstructing the argument form from it? Step number 1, anybody?
You're going to look at the figure and construct, the first statement is going to be sum in.
Whoa, you're sort of multitasking. Let's take one thing at a time for somebody who might be having difficulty. Yep.
Find the conclusion?
No, that's when you have an English language argument. Put the middle term in the third figure in this case. Always start with the middle term. Put it in the figure indicated in the problem. So you have to know the first, second, third, and fourth figures. If you don't know them, in the meantime, refer to that section of the book that discusses mood and figure. In the third figure, the middle term is in the subject position of both premises. That'll wind up being my subject position when I get the rest of the terms in place. What's our second step? From top to bottom, what do we want to do?
Premise, major term, then minor term.
The major term P goes in the major premise. There's only one place for it to go, the predicate position. The minor term S goes in the minor premise. There's only one place for it to go, the predicate position. Subject and predicate of the conclusion are always S and P. So we've got our term letters in place, and how do we want to finish it off? What's left? Yell it right out.
Identifying I can't remember the term, but the structure of the sentence. So it's going to be sum in is not P.
All right. Want to supply the quantifiers and the copula indicated by the mood. So our major premise is an O proposition. Supply the quantifier sum and the copula is not. Our minor premise is an A proposition. Quantifier is all. Copula is. Our conclusion is also an O proposition. So our quantifier is sum, copula is. So we want to do that same procedure all the time. If you want to branch out on your own, that's fine as long as you get from there to here correctly, but I can't vouch for all different procedures. There's certainly not one. I've got 35 people, I'd like to do it one way all the time. So everybody has something to focus on. Okay, so you would do that on your scratch paper for the test. You'd next be instructed to use a Venn diagram to prove the argument form valid or invalid. We're simply numbering our segments in that order all the time. Forget about the author's unnecessarily complicated way of referring to those segments. Well, there are a couple things you have to remember in diagramming your arguments. If you've got one premise that's universal, that's quantity, universal, and the other premise being particular quantity, you must diagram the universal premise first. We do have that situation here. Major premise is particular, major premise is particular, minor premise is universal. So we've got to diagram that universal premise first. Go ahead and get started on that. All M is S. Pull your two circles out of there if that helps. It's not necessary. There it is on the two circles. You just need to accomplish that on the three-circle diagram. That would be 6 and 7, correct? Now for the major premise. Sum M is not P. Take your two circles out if that helps. Sum M is not P. We have to use an X. It has to go somewhere in circle M. Right now we've got B and C to choose from, but the rest of the premise says, but it's not a P. So that eliminates B, and it's got to go in C. You'll notice that C was originally 4, 7. Agreed? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we've just established that there is nothing in 7. So we don't have a choice of where to put this X. It plainly goes in segment 4. Let's check. Is that X inside of M? Oops. Is it inside of M? Yeah, so it is sum M. And is it not inside of P? Yes, it is not. So we've diagrammed the premise correctly. Now, if this argument form is valid, then the truth of those premises in that argument form would establish the truth of the conclusion. Every now and again, I get a student diagramming the conclusion. You absolutely do not diagram the conclusion. That would be making it true in every case. There would be no such thing as an invalid argument form. It's true premises in a valid form that guarantee the truth of the conclusion. You have to let them do their work. So if this is valid, the truth of that conclusion is indicated at this time. If it's not indicated, that's a proof of invalidity. Two conditions have to be met by our three-circle diagram to indicate the truth of our conclusion and therefore the validity of the argument form. There has to be an X inside of circle S. Is there an X somewhere inside of circle S? Yeah. Yes, there is. At the same time, that X must not be inside of circle P. Is it not inside of circle P? Yes. Yes, so it is an S that's not a P, and our conclusion's truth is indicated, and that's our proof of validity. No need in checking for fallacies. There can't be a fallacy if it's a valid argument form. There are questions about that one or the procedure in general?
On the test,
sure.
Part of the answer might be to identify the fallacies, and obviously we would disregard if it's a valid statement, right?
Yeah, but I still, a valid argument form.
Yeah.
But I still might ask you if a fallacy is committed. I won't assume that you got the valid part correct.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
If your diagram shows valid, there cannot be a formal fallacy. If it shows invalid, there must be at least one. But I'm not going to assume you get the diagram correctly. Correct. I'm also going to ask you some questions about your diagrams. I'm not going to check around 200 tests with, 4 to 8 diagrams on each one. If you've done that correctly, you should be able to answer statements true or false as follows. In this argument forms diagram, segments 5 and 6 are crosshatched. Well, if you did that diagram correctly, the answer is obviously false, as 5 is not crosshatched. There's an X on the line of circle P in this argument forms diagram. Well, if you diagrammed it correctly, you would answer that false, right? In this argument forms diagram, there's an X in segment 4. That would be a true answer. In this argument forms diagram, segments 6 and 7 are crosshatched. Sure. So I could ask you about your diagram on a true-false format without having to look at them. Good? Next.
Right?
Yes.
Is it multiple choice?
No. A004. Go ahead and get started on that. Help each other out. You want to. Step 1, middle term in the fourth figure as indicated. The fourth figure is going to be in the predicate position of the major premise, subject position of the minor premise. Major term P in the major premise, minor term S in the minor premise. S and P as subject and predicate of the conclusion. Always, always, always. Is there a question about that part of the procedure thus far? Sir?
So you said S and P are always going to be conclusions?
Yep.
No matter which?
Yep. Question is the subject and predicate of the conclusion always symbolized as S and P, respectively? Yes. Yep. Finish it off with your quantifier and copula. Major premise is an A proposition, all is. Minor premise is an O, some is not, as well as the conclusion. Now you have to know quantity, quality, and distribution in order to identify fallacies. So we might as well review that while we have an argument form up here. Universal affirmative, distributed, undistributed. Particular negative, undistributed, distributed. Same with the conclusion. Okay, use your Venn diagram to prove validity or invalidity. Which premise must we diagram first, if any?
The universal.
The universal of the pair, that would be this time the major premise. Go ahead and do that. Anybody do the two-circle method? Could help. Not necessary. All P is M. I'd say segment A over here. What do you think? That would be on the three-circle diagram, segments 2, 3. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Some M is not S. Oh, good. This is something we need to get a reminder of. On the three-circle diagram, where must we place our x so that it is in M but not in S?
C.
Okay, it goes in C on the two-circle diagram. You'll notice that C on the three-circle diagram is divided into two existing segments. By existing, I mean both are uncrosshatched. It's in that situation that you have to put the x on the line between those segments. That line between 6 and 7. So we have successfully diagrammed what the premise states. That is inside of M, and it's not inside of S. But we're non-committal about its being a P or not. So the premise doesn't tell us if it is or not. We can't stick it in P or leave it out of P. That would be diagramming a third premise that does not exist. Well, if that argument form is valid, then those true premises in this form will establish the truth of the conclusion. Some S is not P. How do you read that? Valid or invalid? Invalid? Now, isn't anybody wondering, what about all those S's in 1 and 4? They're not in P. What do you think about that?
But there's no X in the diagram.
Thank you. A particular proposition, whether it's a premise or a conclusion, its truth has to be indicated by, I know we've gone over this before, I'm reminding you. A particular proposition, whether the premise or a premise or the conclusion, its truth has to be indicated by the presence of an X in the appropriate place. So what would that be? There would have to be an X inside of circle S, for one thing, and there's not. So you can stop. Right? Okay, well, we've got a Venn diagram that shows an invalid argument form. Although, really, you only have to check the fallacy that I'm asking you about on the test. It's a true-false answer. Right? So I might say this argument form commits the existential fallacy. That's the one you check for. Or maybe I'll ask you 2 of them. Maybe do some more work. But to get familiar with them, I think it's a good idea to go through them in the order in which we learned them. So we threw out fallacy of 4 terms. We're not responsible for that. So the first one that we learned about was the fallacy of undistributed middle term. That middle term has to be distributed in at least one premise. If it's not, then that's the fallacy that's committed. So you have to know when a term is distributed or not. And you have to keep in mind that whatever is in this position is the subject of that proposition, premise or conclusion. And whatever is in this position, I don't care what letter it is, it doesn't matter. Whatever is in that position is the predicate of that proposition, premise or conclusion. So that's why we learned that the subject term or the predicate term is distributed or not. It doesn't matter really what letter is there. So we have a middle term in the predicate position of an A proposition. Is that distributed or not?
Yes.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Did I say predicate position? Because it is. Is that what I
you
said? Okay. It's not. Here we have a middle term in the subject position of an O proposition. Is that distributed?
No.
No. So we have at least that fallacy committed. Undistributed middle term. Let's continue. If either term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in its premise. If it's the major term in violation of that rule, it's illicit major term. Minor term, illicit minor term. So we have an O proposition here. Is either term distributed in the conclusion? If so, which one?
S.
S is not distributed in the conclusion.
Oh.
P is distributed in the O proposition. You must learn that. So it has to be distributed in its major premise. Here it's the subject. See, it's the subject of an A proposition. So is the subject of an A proposition distributed or not?
Yes.
It is. So he's good to go. This one's not distributed, so it doesn't have to be distributed there. The rule says if a term is distributed in the conclusion. What's up next? Exclusive premises, which refers to the quality negative. Do we have 2 premises with negative quality? No, you have to know your quantity quality distribution. There's no way around it. If you don't, you're not going to be able to do anything on the test, or pretty much anything. You just be guessing. Sorry. That's the way it goes. That's affirmative, that's negative, not exclusive premises. Next up, drawing an affirmative conclusion from one negative premise. Well, we do have just one negative premise, but the conclusion's negative as well. So it does not commit that fallacy. And then the last one, existential fallacy. That's committed when both premises have universal quantity and the conclusion has particular quantity. Do we have that situation?
No.
No, we do not. So there's just one fallacy here, that of undistributed middle term. Okay, so we had an X on the line here. You have to remember that. And what else did we say here? We reminded you that you're not allowed to read there being anything there in 1 and 4 to try to justify that conclusion, right? Some S means there's an X in the right place. Good? Questions about that one? How many people have this down?
With my cheat sheet, I do.
Cheat sheet? Maybe we'll see if we get somebody to come up and show us your stuff.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Once everything is set up on the board, I understand what's going on, but I still have a problem with, like, when you have the number, like you have the 0803 and the 8004.
Yes.
The 3 and the 4, I still get confused with that. How do
Well, there's only 4 things to remember, and it is on page 208. Check out 208. That number is called figure. It tells you where M goes. What? Find that on 208?
I'm trying to memorize them. How they look.
Yes. In the front of the book. It's probably, is it in the back as well? They've got the stuff all over the place. Yeah, it's in the front of the book too. Very first inside cover.
Makes it easy. That's what he told us.
Any other questions?
I'll remember that.
Makes it a lot easier.
You must have your questions answered tonight. Next week's the big dance. How are we doing over here? Good?
If conclusion is invalid,
There's no such thing as an invalid conclusion.
or if the statement is invalid as a whole,
Statements aren't invalid. Argument forms are valid or invalid. Statements are true or false.
if the argument form is invalid, must it commit a fallacy?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
If
All
there's
right.
a fallacy committed, then it is invalid.
Is there an easy way to remember all these?
Remember what? Yeah, do about 5 of them, and you'll be as good at it as anybody in the world is.
Huh? I kind of probably
Really?
in my E-logic.
Oh, let's see. EIO, that's valid. We know that. OAO2, we just had A's and O's. Let's skip to number 8. EAE3. Go ahead, get started. Ask your partner to help. Take advantage. Third figure. Where does that M go?
Both of them on this side.
On the subject of the major.
Yeah, the subject.
There's some students who don't want to remember all the technical vocabulary.
That's what you just showed.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's easy. Yeah. It's easier that way.
Third figure, that middle term is in the subject position. Both premises.
Okay, drawing the circles.
Major term P in the major premise. Only one place for it to go now. That's the value of sticking M in there, first of all. Minor term S in the minor premise. There's only one place for it to go. S and P, subject and predicate of the conclusion. Always, always, always. Quantifier and copula indicated by the move. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Should have that. Yes? Okay, Venn diagram. Does it matter which premise we diagram first?
They're both universal.
So does it matter which premise we diagram first?
No.
No, it does not. Dealer's choice. No M is P. What shall we crosshatch? 5, 6. All M is S. What do you say?
7,
6.
Do I need to crosshatch that again?
Yes.
Yes. In diagramming a universal premise, that's A or E, just remember, I'm always going to crosshatch two segments, even if one of them has already been crosshatched in diagramming the other premise. There's a couple reasons for that. Doesn't really concern us at this point. So, does our Venn diagram indicate the truth of this conclusion at this time? That no S's are P's, or no portion of S exists within circle P? Does it indicate that? No, it does not. What part of circle S is inside of P? 2. It's still in play. So our conclusion's truth has not been indicated. We have true premises and a false conclusion. Not possible in a valid argument form, possible in this argument form, therefore invalid, right? We better find a fallacy. Let's go through them one at a time again. Is my middle term distributed in at least one premise? Yeah. It's distributed in both premises. Right?
Yeah.
Only has to be in one.
Yeah.
Is either term distributed in the conclusion?
No.
They both are.
Yeah, both sides.
So each one must be distributed in its premise. Let's check the major term. Distributed here. Well, again, it's the predicate of an E, so it's distributed there. Minor terms, distributed, yes. Here it's the predicate of an A. Distributed? No. So we have illicit minor term, distributed in the conclusion, not in the premise in which it occurs. Illicit minor term. Let's keep going. Do we have two negative and therefore exclusive premises? No. Do we have an affirmative conclusion from just one negative premise?
No.
No. Do we have two universal premises and a particular conclusion, therefore the existential fallacy? No. See, it's the same thing over and over again. So what do you think? Have you mastered it? Do you have a question? Here, I'll make one up. See what you do with this. each other out, take advantage.